Before we begin, I kindly ask you to spare a minute of silence for the victims of the genocide in Gaza, Palestine. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. In December 2023, a minor headline by the Sun Star caught my attention. It involved a 72-year-old Japanese-American man who was killed by his 30-year-old Filipino wife and her ex-lover in Liloan, Cebu. Roxanne Mandukita Sugawara and Gami Tinaghanaw Binungkasan later confessed to the crime after being arrested earlier that month. There was not much else to read about this crime, but it made me think of another crime some 19 years before, when a Filipina and British man crossed paths in Angeles City, changing both of their lives in the most radical of ways. This is the case of Steven Alston Davis. Mayong adlaw and mabuhay lagim fam. Welcome to season 5. This is our very first episode. I'm glad that I'm finally back in the podcasting world again. I have truly missed it and missed creating content for you. Hopefully there will be no interruptions this season. Fingers crossed. As always, please do not forget to support this podcast by following me on all my socials as listed in the show notes. Most of my podcast updates are on Instagram, and I'm still trying to go viral on TikTok, so please be patient. I have a blog with just the sources I use for each episode. That link is also in the show notes. I'm also trying to take my YouTube more seriously, so please make sure to subscribe and support me over there. If you are feeling charitable, I do welcome gifts in the form of donations through my buymecoffee.com platform. The link is also in the show notes. Now, without further ado, let us get into today's episode. As always, details in this episode might be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourselves whilst listening. Unlike most of the cases I cover here on Lagim, today's case takes us to Nottingham in England first. Nottingham is a city in the East Midlands that traces its beginnings to 919 AD. Today it is a bustling city with a young population thanks to 2 universities, a couple of colleges, and at least 1 business school. I've had the privilege of visiting Nottingham a couple of times as a law student for some lectures on human rights and also privately. I always found it charming and even considered doing a master's there a long time ago. Alas, it was not meant to be. It was in Nottingham that Steven Alston Davis was born on the 27th of March, 1970. He was one of 3 children who were raised by Mother Margaret and their father, whose name I was unable to find out about. Steven's dad passed away when Steven was merely 14 years old, and a little while after that, soon-to-be stepfather Alan was introduced to the family. Steven found a father figure in him, something that was missing after losing his own father. Steven's family noticed quite early that he was smart. Eventually, he would turn his attention to computers, a hobby that eventually became a career, first in Nottingham and then in Hong Kong, after he was offered a lucrative job where he was promised 3 times the salary he was earning in England. As a 21-year-old man, this was an exciting opportunity and prospect. His family encouraged him to take the job and see the world, and so he did. In Hong Kong, Steven thrived and had the opportunity not only to earn a good living, but also to spend that money on things he liked. Whilst in Hong Kong, he joined a flying club in Angeles City in the Philippines. For Hong Kongers and expats in Hong Kong, Angeles, and the Philippines in general may have been viewed as a bit of a weekend playground, and then some. For some, it still is. The Philippines is only 2 hours away by plane, and it offers fun, good food, and shopping possibilities for a fraction of the prices in Hong Kong. It is a fascinating destination for the moneyed ones in Hong Kong, and it certainly was back then, even for Steven. The flying club activities were followed by parties with girls, a lot of girls, in the bars of Angeles. This is not a surprising detail. Parts of Angeles have a beleaguered history and reputation that can be blamed on a few factors, mainly the presence of the US Army base in the past, poverty, and the continuous influx of mainly foreign men who visit certain establishments that prop up sex tourism. This is not a generalization of Angeles as a city at all. It has seen lots of changes and improvements since the 90s. I myself visited it years ago and found it quite interesting. Admittedly, I've not been there for a long time, but rest assured, when Steven Davis was vacationing in Angeles in the early 90s, just after the US military left, Angeles, and specifically the red light district in and around Fields Avenue, was an in-demand area amongst men who went to the Philippines for very specific reasons. It was during one of these visits that Steven met Evelyn. Long before meeting Steven, Evelyn was a simple girl from an island in Samar called Daram. Back in the 90s, Daram, where people mainly earned money through fishing and farming, did not have even proper running water and electricity, and poverty was and remains a huge problem. At 13, Evelyn, who had little to no education, decided that she wanted to better her life and the lives of her parents. She had decided that it was time for her to leave Daram and find work elsewhere. Her plan led her to one of the bars in Angeles City. According to one documentary produced by Real Crime, a rather popular channel on YouTube, becoming a bar girl was something that Evelyn actually wanted. A relative stated in an interview in that documentary that Evelyn wanted to meet an American she could marry, and she thought that the only way to achieve that was to work at one of the bars in Angeles. There's no direct statement from Evelyn about this, and so I took this statement by her relative with a huge grain of salt. As you will later hear, another person connected to Evelyn had something different to say about Evelyn's job as a bar girl. So there she was, a 13-year-old Evelyn finally made it to Angeles after announcing her plans to her mother. She quickly got a job at a bar, which is something that still horrifies me, by the way, but does not surprise me at all, as I already said. Because of the government's lack of ability to take care of its own people, a vulnerable minor like Evelyn had to go to these lengths just to survive. Someone like her at that age should be in school, living life as a teenager, and not be at a bar fielding the grimy hands of foreign men in exchange for money. And we know that with these types of jobs, most girls were and are doing so much more than just dancing or serving drinks. We are talking about the red light district, after all. Now, in the documentary, after we heard from one relative that Evelyn's dream was to become a bar girl, Evelyn's sister offered a different perspective. She was also interviewed, and she stated that Evelyn was actually quite embarrassed about her job. At some point in the video, she said that her sister was forced into that kind of work, and Evelyn's sister did not just mean the bar girl work. I understood that the work being emphasized here is sex work. Now, I feel weird even saying sex work here because when I think of sex work, I think of a sex worker who 100% willingly chooses this work, someone who has agency over her body, her work, and who she wants to work for or with, and is, most importantly, of age. For someone like Evelyn, who was vulnerable, poor, a minor, it felt like she was forced, and I think I would rather believe Evelyn's sister rather than the relative who stated that being a bar girl, which included sex work, was Evelyn's dream job. I think in this special case, I would rather use the word prostitution because Evelyn was a victim, and there's no doubt about it. After having worked in Angeles City for around 4 years, and as fate would have it, Steven Davis walked into the bar Evelyn worked in, and suddenly their two worlds collided, both of them not knowing how their lives had suddenly forever changed from that point onwards. According to the Real Crime documentary, on the night Steven and Evelyn met, he was immediately smitten with her and decided to take her out for the night. He then proceeded to give Evelyn's boss, the bar owner, around £500 the next day to, release Evelyn from whatever agreement or contract she had with the bar owner. The way this transaction was presented in the documentary feels like someone buying someone's freedom, and it is just wrong on so many levels and yet so plausible at the same time, knowing the working conditions of bar girls and sex workers in the Philippines and the fact that the bar owners are almost always run by people who do not really care about these women's and girls' welfare at all. And so Evelyn was free at last in some sense of the word, and both she and Steven did not waste time starting their lives together. Evelyn was 17 and Steven was 27 at that time. A lot can be said about this relationship, especially this age gap. I will not stop saying this, but she was a minor. She was vulnerable, poor. She was far from her family and any support system. Now, remember that she had been living and working in Angeles City's red light district for almost 4 years. I can only imagine that anyone who'd gone through something like that would likely not want to stay any longer, even for just a second, if they know that there's something better out there, even if that something is a foreign man 10 years their senior. Comments about Evelyn that you would find under YouTube videos or on Facebook are wide-ranging for obvious reasons. With regards to how her relationship with Steven came about, some say she saw Steven as a meal ticket out of prostitution and poverty, and that may have been true. She told her parents something similar according to the documentary, but can you actually blame her? Some comments, on the other hand, are negative towards Steven, blaming him for taking advantage of Evelyn's vulnerability, her young age, and perhaps her naivety. I also cannot blame the commenters for saying so. In one bit, for example, within the documentary, Steven's stepfather relayed something Steven had apparently said about how he really, quote-unquote, rescued Evelyn from the awful bar life. Again, that may have been true, technically, and Evelyn must have been thankful, but there is a heavy tinge of white saviorism underlining not only the action of rescuing Evelyn, but that statement being made. It also ignores all the other red flags within such a relationship, like a power imbalance between these two with such a huge age gap, their financial positions, their upbringing, nationality, and so forth. Now, for me personally, and going back to the issue of power imbalance, that always worries me, especially in the context of a whirlwind relationship. Such a power imbalance almost always spells doom, usually for the vulnerable woman. We have seen it in other cases of femicide or battered wife or girlfriend syndrome. The only thing that really made some people gloss over the power imbalance between Steven and Evelyn is the fact that what happened later in their relationship completely subverted the template of such imbalanced relationships. As the relationship progressed, it was time to finally introduce Evelyn to Steven's mom, Margaret, and stepdad, Alan. The two couples met in Hong Kong in 1997. In the documentary, Margaret is the main person who gives us insight into the couple's new relationship when they all first met. There were some quick sound bites by Evelyn who talked about their experience in Hong Kong, but really the main person who gave us the insight was Margaret. So we heavily rely on her point of view. In the documentary, Margaret found Evelyn very beautiful, shy, and polite. It would seem that Margaret was accepting of Evelyn and there were no bad impressions on both sides. The holiday in Hong Kong took a surprising turn, however, when Steven and Evelyn shared with Margaret and Alan that they would be getting married right then and there. Margaret reckoned that Steven really wanted his mother and stepfather to be part of this momentous occasion, and so a semi-shotgun wedding would have to do. We learned that it was a simple occasion, that Evelyn could not initially say her vows because she could not read said vows off paper. As it turned out, Evelyn could not read. But after all those minor complications, the two were officially hitched. This was on the 20th of March, 1997. After the wedding, the newlyweds went on their honeymoon to Puerto Galera and took Margaret and Alan with them. It would seem that at this point, Margaret's opinion of Evelyn had slightly changed. She said that it would seem, from her perspective, that Steven loved Evelyn more than she loved him. Allegedly, love gestures were not reciprocated, like Steven wanting to hold Evelyn's hand, but her not letting him do so. The documentary then implied that Margaret may have had ulterior motives for saying such things by including a comment from Evelyn where she said how Steven told her about his mother not wanting him to get married to her. This part piqued my interest, and I will try to explain why in a way that will hopefully not sound convoluted, because I tried to explain the same thing to a friend and she just looked at me with a quizzical brow. Now, bear with me here. This case is from 2002, admittedly a time when Filipino news outlets as well as international ones were not yet into putting their content online. As in many cases I've covered from the 70s, 80s, 90s, or early 2000s, online reports are hard to come by unless we are talking about a super popular case. The Davis Bohol case was not a big case at the time, both in the Philippines and abroad, so there was not much to go on for me who can only do online research. I would have loved to have had some access to physical newspaper archives or clippings to fill in lots of the blanks, but alas, I work with what I have. So the main sources I used were the Real Crime YouTube video I mentioned so many times already, and a few articles. Whilst reading or watching these sources, I could not get rid of a nagging feeling because I felt like I was watching a disproportionately one-sided narrative. Evelyn appears in the documentary and was asked a few questions, but it really felt like her voice was not much in it compared to the others who were firmly in Steven's camp, especially his mother, Margaret. Also, since this video was a British production, as I understood it, I also felt like lots of the cultural nuances were missing, and as a result, the Philippines and the Filipinos were unnecessarily portrayed in a very negative light. There was an underlying us versus them narrative, almost. Now, before you point fingers at me and call me biased about this case, I fully can assure you that I'm not. I get who the victim and perpetrator are in this case, but I simply would have wanted to hear more of what Evelyn, her friends, and family members had to say as well, since we already have a documentary anyway, and a documentary ought to at least try and offer us a balanced perspective on a subject. In most cases, we do not get such a chance to hear both victims and perpetrators say anything at all, let alone be in a documentary the way that the Davises and the Bohols were in this one. I simply wanted other sources or more sources in general because I constantly had a feeling that I was not seeing a much bigger picture. A prime example was this implication by the documentary that Margaret may have disapproved of Evelyn more than what was actually said in the video, but then there was no follow-through on that seemingly minor aspect. Of course, ultimately, this does not have a huge bearing on the crime at hand, but the nosy person in me just wanted to know more and felt like there was more. Anyway, let us go back to the story. Evelyn eventually fell pregnant, and then again 2 years later. Steven and Evelyn had 2 kids, Jessica and Joshua, and they initially lived in Hong Kong before ultimately settling down in Angeles, where Steven and Evelyn first met. Life was good for the young family. They lived in a good neighborhood, and Steven's high salary went a long way in the Philippines. It would seem from the documentary that Evelyn did not work in the classic sense of the word. Of course, she was still working, as in she was a stay-at-home mom who received a monthly allowance from Steve for all the usual expenses. So at least from the outside, life was good for the Davises. But as the documentary then shows, some cracks started to appear around 3 or 4 years into the marriage. Evelyn, at least from this particular narrative, is described as having become lazy after her 2 children were born. It was mentioned that she did not do household chores anymore, therefore necessitating the hiring of nannies and maids. Some of her own relatives stated that Evelyn always talked about money and nothing else, and it generally seemed like she had changed altogether. It was highlighted in the documentary that Evelyn's parents benefited greatly from Evelyn's change in financial circumstances, something that was not looked upon favorably by the Davises back in England. There was also a budding suspicion that Evelyn may have started an affair. Evelyn's sister, who was interviewed for the documentary, alleged that she pushed her sister to tell her whether she was having an affair or not. After a while, according to Evelyn's sister, Evelyn finally admitted that she was having an affair with a local security guard named Arnold Aduray. Evelyn disputed this and still disputes it. Even in the documentary, she denied the affair allegation. Eventually, Steven had also grown suspicious of Evelyn. The documentary implies that the reason why Steven had become suspicious was because of money going missing and a general mismanagement of household finances. An example given was how the money allocated for Jessica's school fees were never actually given to the school. Steve only found out about this when he brought his daughter to school, only to find out that she was never actually enrolled. The straw that broke the camel's back was ultimately Evelyn pawning off her wedding ring. This was something that apparently hurt Steven a lot. Now, in one of the interviews, Steven's mom, Margaret, stated that some, if not most, of the missing money went to Evelyn's boyfriend, Aduray. She said that she found this out much later, but in the documentary, we do not get more information as to what exactly Margaret found out and how. We just know that at this point, the marriage was fully on the rocks, and even Steven had decided that he too could have his fun. Just like the old days, Steven started frequenting his old stomping ground in Angeles City together with his friends, meeting girls, partying with them, and sleeping with them. Despite all that, though, from what I understood in the documentary, Steven wanted to still give his marriage a shot. He gave Evelyn an ultimatum: give all the missing money back and get a job. He also offered the alternative of her going back to school. Despite the ultimatum, according to Steven's friends, nothing changed, so Steven threatened divorce. Whilst he did not make good his threat of divorce, he did stop Evelyn's allowance, which according to the documentary disabled Evelyn's spending, meaning she could not give her family, her friends, and maybe her lover money like she used to. What I did not like at this juncture in the documentary is that one of Steven's friends had apparently warned him after he cut off his wife's allowance. He specifically warned him about how, quote unquote, these people are crazy. I took this as a sort of generalization of Filipinos, or just Evelyn's family really, who will act all crazy if you stop acting like their meal ticket. This friend continued to emphasize that Steven was the golden goose of his little family, a term that Steven also used to describe himself in relation to Evelyn's extended family. This friend then apparently had to remind Steven about the moral of the golden goose story, in that the golden goose eventually gets killed. Part of me feels like there are a lot of microaggressions that must be unpacked there, but also I could just be reading too much into this. One thing I know for sure, though, is that Steven's friend is biased, which is totally fine, knowing that he was friends with Steven more than he was friends with Evelyn, if at all. But this statement was ultimately used by the makers of the documentary as an in for what would come next in this story. Steven and Evelyn's marriage was broken at that point. Steven's mom and her partner were on holiday in the Philippines for the last time before the events of July 17th and 18th, 2002 took place. A particularly bitter memory for Margaret, who did not know that that would be the last time she'd hug her son. The following account of what transpired on the 17th and 18th of July 2002 are the agreed facts as used by the courts, including the Supreme Court. On Wednesday, the 17th of July 2002, Steven and a close friend of his named Michael Thomas Dunn, who was also featured in the documentary, worked until 10 p.m. Steven at that point was the Chief Technology Officer for JC Software, a local subsidiary of Hong Kong-based corporation Jade Cool Entertainment. Together with Michael, Steven lived in a 2-story apartment in Barangay Poblacion in Makati during the work week. After working late on the 17th of July, the friends went home to the apartment in Makati. Steven was not quite done with work yet and so continued to work on his computer after arriving. He was in his room. Michael, on the other hand, got ready to pick up his girlfriend from the airport and left around 11:30 that night. The couple then got back in at around 1 a.m. on the 18th of July. They both then went to bed shortly after arriving. Around an hour later at 2 p.m., Jennifer, Michael's girlfriend, woke him up to say that there seemed to be someone in the apartment. She told Michael that there was movement and flashing lights outside their room. Michael was not initially worried because he thought Steven was just playing a prank on them, so he called out, "What are you doing?" Instead of a response from Steven, 3 men with drawn guns burst into the room. One of the men aimed his gun at Michael and asked, "Ito ba? Ito ba? Is this him? Is this him?" Before anyone could say anything, another man grabbed Jennifer and dragged her into Michael's bathroom. One of the men took Michael's keys, wallet, and cell phone, and although it was not clear from the agreed facts where Michael was at this point or what he was doing, it would seem that the men then proceeded to barge into Steven's bedroom where he was still fast asleep. One of the men, the same one who shouted "Ito ba" earlier, proceeded to fire 4 consecutive shots at Steven, hitting him mostly in the back. The man then made a hasty escape, and Michael hurriedly went into his friend's room to find Steven now lying lifeless in his own bed. Not wanting to give up on his friend that easily, Michael administered CPR on Steven after checking for his pulse, hoping to avoid what seemed to be the inevitable at that point. Steven was non-responsive. Now, in the Real Crime documentary, Michael's account was a little bit different. He said that when he saw Steven in his bed, he immediately went to the neighbor's house to call the police. He did not mention administering CPR, but he did feel for a pulse before leaving the room. In any case, the police were eventually called and arrived later to the crime scene. An ambulance also arrived and took Steven to the Makati Medical Center, where he was ultimately pronounced dead on arrival. Michael Dunn, wanting to do the right thing after his best friend was shot, attempted to reach Evelyn by phone. He failed. At around 6 in the morning, he finally got through to Evelyn. 4 hours later, the two met in person. Michael noted that Evelyn seemed rather emotionless about what had just happened to her husband. She was not sad or in mourning, Michael would later say. Hours later, Steven's body would be examined. According to court documents, quote, the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI medical legal officer, found that Steven sustained 4 gunshot wounds at the upper left portion of his back, including 4 bullet holes at the back of his upper left arm, just below the shoulder, end of quote. So the police now had a brutal execution-style murder at their hands, and in those early days, and at least on the surface, it seemed random. The police, in my understanding, did not really suspect Evelyn in the immediate aftermath of the murder. However, both Steven's family and Michael were already very suspicious of Evelyn even then. Michael would say in the documentary, for example, that after his best friend was shot, he shouted, "That fucking bitch killed him," referring to Evelyn. Now, again, I will be referencing the documentary a lot from here on out, but also a personal column that Margaret wrote for the UK newspaper, The Independent, where she gave an abridged account of the days immediately after Steven's death and how the whole story eventually unfolded as the months and years went on.
I met up with Steven's wife, Evelyn, and, it was 23 at the funeral parlour. And they'd known each other for 8 years and had been married for, I think, 6. Well, we liked her. She was always very polite and we got on so well. It didn't worry him that she'd been a dancer in a bar, so didn't really worry me. But when I met her this time, she was unusually cold. She just wanted to know if I'd seen Michael and what he'd seen, what he'd said. She said her family was staying at their home on Haylers and she wouldn't let me go there, which I found suspicious. I went with a bodyguard and as well a police escort. There was no one there apart from Evelyn, the maids and the kiddies. The landlady told me that Evelyn had been entertaining a lot of male friends while Stephen had been away during the week. Evelyn didn't get any more relaxed with us and on one occasion called me saying she wanted me to meet me in Haley City at midnight. When I told her one of Stephen's friends, he said if we'd have gone, well, we would have been dead too.
Margaret went on to say in the documentary that her daughter-in-law also did not seem upset after her husband's death. Evelyn's coldness and unemotional state bothered Margaret. The question about Michael also bothered her because Evelyn seemed unusually keen to know if Margaret had talked to Steven's best friend. Margaret would say in the documentary that it was at this point that she started to note things in a little notebook that she would then carry for the next couple years. Every interaction and every little detail that Margaret thought had something to do with Steven's death was noted in that little notebook. The next day, according to Margaret, she gave Evelyn around £200 to feed the children and pay the bills. As a grieving mother and as someone who probably had already budding suspicions about Evelyn's role in the death of her own son, I think Margaret's senses were especially heightened. She highlighted the following in her personal column for The Independent, some of which we already know from what the documentary covered. When I phoned her that evening, she was having a party, which she claimed was a wake. The police had also said that she hadn't shed a tear when they collected her to see the body, and all she said was that her husband had a house in England and some insurance money. Stephen had recently told me their relationship was strained. Things were going missing. Evelyn wasn't paying the bills, and he had started to cut her allowance. I found among his things a receipt for her wedding ring, which she had pawned just before his murder. At this point, the budding suspicion was a full-blown theory. that Evelyn may have been the orchestrator of her husband's demise. So Margaret decided to hire a private detective. The police, who were still hell-bent on believing that the killers may have been someone from Davis's line of work, were also not doing enough, according to Margaret, so hiring a private detective was a no-brainer for the grieving mother. It was during one of the private detective's stakeouts that he took pictures of people who were going in and out of Evelyn's home. These pictures were presented to Margaret, who also, it would seem, showed it to Michael, Stephen's best friend, who was present at Stephen's home when he was shot. I need to mention at this point that in Margaret's column for The Independent, Michael's name seemed to have been changed to Martin, and I'm suspecting that this may have been done to protect his identity back then, but Michael is officially mentioned in court documents, so I am sticking with Michael. So, Michael. He saw some of the pictures taken by the private detective, and he said that he recognized at least one man who was, according to him, at Stephen's home that night of the shooting. This person was later identified as Arnold Aduray, who was then rumored to be Evelyn's boyfriend. A month after Stephen's death and a few stakeouts later, Margaret and Michael went to the police to report their findings. Aduray was then arrested, and from that arrest also came the identification of the other men who were with him that night when Stephen was killed. All were positively identified by Michael from further pictures taken by Margaret's private eye. When Evelyn was later asked about these men, she simply denied knowing them. Both in Margaret's personal column and the documentary, we learned that her life and that of her partner Alan may have been in danger after the arrests of Aduray and the other men. I could not really find anything specific that may have led to this conclusion, but from Margaret's account, it would seem that the British Embassy, whether they had evidence to believe so or not, called Margaret and her partner, advising both of them to leave the country as they were worried about their safety. We also learned that Margaret took Jessica with her, but not Joshua. Jessica was already with her after Margaret persuaded Evelyn to let the little girl stay with her and her partner one day. However, Joshua was still with Evelyn, with Evelyn's parents to be more specific. Now, online forums who talk about this case are very much split about the legality or legitimacy of Margaret taking Jessica with her. Did she have consent to do so? Did she have custody or parental rights? How was she able to do this? I really do not know the answers, and I'm not willing to just speculate, so I will have to just park this topic here and continue with the rest of the story. Moving on, and just to recap, of the 3 suspects, only 2 had been arrested so far. Michael, who was the only witness, had decided to lay low for his own safety. Evelyn, according to Margaret, still had Joshua with her or her parents, and they were spending time far from Manila and Angeles, presumably in Evelyn's birthplace in Daram, Samar. The investigation was dragging on, and the third shooter was still on the run. At some point in Margaret's personal column, she talked about how she negotiated with Evelyn's relatives or her parents who had Joshua at some point later that year. The negotiation was to have Joshua fly over to England with someone that Margaret trusted in exchange for £200 that would be given to Evelyn's parents or relatives. From what we have learned from Margaret's personal column and the documentary so far, Evelyn was not with Joshua at all, so this might have contributed to these negotiations working so well in Margaret's favor. As for the Filipino grandparents, the documentary interviewed Joshua's grandfather, who essentially explained that letting Joshua go was the best decision he could make, and that it was in the boy's best interest, seeing as Evelyn's parents are poor and could not provide a good future for the young child. As for Margaret, who was eager to finally see Joshua, she admitted that she was advised not to pick up Joshua herself, as Evelyn had started telling people and the police that Margaret essentially kidnapped Jessica, and there was a possibility that Margaret could be arrested if she stepped on Philippine soil. It is unclear if Evelyn at this point was made aware of Joshua's imminent departure from the Philippines. Again, speculations as to the legality of what Margaret did, as someone who originally would not have parental rights since she's only a grandmother, were allowed in forums. And these forums are divided between people who viewed her actions as extremely problematic and people who thought that the children were better off with Margaret in England. Family law be damned. In the end, Joshua was accompanied by one of Margaret's informants to the UK by November 2002. My research did not cough up any additional information from this point on until late 2003, when the third shooter, Robin Butas, was finally arrested. Robin Butas is Evelyn's brother-in-law, and it is this very close familial connection to Evelyn that finally became her downfall after Robin became a state witness. According to the documentary, Margaret worked tirelessly to help gather evidence to move the case along. She also maintained close ties with some of Evelyn's relatives, and it was this relationship that finally provided a breakthrough in the case. One of the relatives Margaret was friends with was Evelyn's aunt, who would later confess that she actually knew where Robin Butas was hiding. The same aunt eventually convinced Robin to turn himself in, which eventually and inevitably led to Evelyn's arrest later on. Now, let me pause again here for a few minutes to try to fill in a gap that some of you might have noticed by now. Despite the allegations that had been circling around for almost a year at this point about how Aduray was Evelyn's boyfriend and how she eventually admitted to this and how that connection ought to really be investigated, given that Aduray was one of the shooters, the police, it would seem, still could not or did not fully pursue that line of inquiry. I could not find any definitive information whether they did, and if they did, what exactly was done and what did they find out? I'm only guessing here, but it is possible that Evelyn, despite admitting at some point that she had a relationship with Aduray, denied having any connection to the shooting, and the police could not find anything that connected her to it. May these be messages between lovers or any physical evidence that places Evelyn at the crime scene. As far as Evelyn's story goes, she was way over in Angeles City when the shooting happened, so how could she be involved, right? Aduray was probably also not speaking up, so Evelyn was living a normal life until her brother-in-law was arrested. As per Margaret's personal column, a plea bargain was eventually worked out between Robin Butas and the prosecution with Margaret's blessing, turning Robin Butas into a state witness, as I have already mentioned. So, what did Robin tell the police and eventually the courts when the trial against Evelyn finally took place? Here is a quote from a Supreme Court decision that was published way later when Evelyn was going through her appeals process. Please remember that the appellant mentioned in this quote pertains to Evelyn. Quote,
Robin contended that the appellant was responsible for inducing/persuading him, Arnold, and Alexander to perpetrate the killing of Stephen. He further stated that the appellant and Arnold, as in fact admitted to him by the appellant, were having a love affair, as he would oftentimes see them caress and kiss each other in the living room of their house in Angeles City. Robin also testified that, at about 11 o'clock in the evening of July 17, 2002, the appellant roused him from his sleep and required him to join them. Robin then rode a white car together with Arnold, Alexander, and the appellant, who acted as the guide in proceeding towards Stephen's apartment. Upon reaching Stephen's place, the appellant gave Arnold the keys of the house and forthwith ordered the group to alight from the car. Upon gaining entry, the three performed all acts of execution. Riding the same car, Arnold, Alexander, Robin, and Evelyn returned to Angeles City. Even as they were traveling, Evelyn warned them never to tell anybody about the incident. Robin, however, divulged the violent incident to his wife, Gina Bohol Butas, Evelyn's sister. In essence, the material points of Robin's testimony were wholly corroborated by Gina. According to Gina, the appellant admitted that she was in love with Arnold. She added that the appellant confided to her the plan to kill Stephen in order for the appellant and Arnold to freely stay together.
End of quote. This quote from the Supreme Court document gave us plenty of insight into what had happened on July 17th and 18th, 2002. One thing that surprised me, however, was Gina's confession that Evelyn actually told her about her plan to kill Stephen so she could be with her lover Adoray. I also mentioned earlier that in the documentary, Gina also admitted that her sister told her about the affair, but the plan to kill Stephen was not mentioned in the documentary. This got me thinking that Gina may have sat on this information until her husband, Robin Butas, finally came out of hiding a couple of years later. This is just pure speculation on my side because I just lack the information. On one hand, I cannot imagine Gina telling the police about this very key piece of information right after the shooting and Evelyn not getting arrested sooner, even before Robin Butas resurfaced. On the other hand, the police have proven themselves inefficient at best and corrupt in the worst and most cases. I think there's a tiny part of me that would like to believe that in a case where there was seemingly no real movement for the last 2 years, a statement from a potential suspect's sister should be shaking the police to the core and prompting them to chase down Evelyn at all costs. But that's just me. Robin's testimony was truly damning for Evelyn. Following his confession, an arrest warrant was issued by Judge Sixto Marela Jr. of the Makati Regional Trial Court, Branch 139. As I said, Evelyn was eventually arrested in Barangay Panan, Zambales on the 17th of February 2004. By the 25th of November 2004, the same trial court in Makati found Evelyn guilty of murder, qualified by treachery, and subsequently sentenced her to life in prison. She was also made liable to pay civil indemnity in the amount of 50,000 pesos. In their case against Evelyn, the prosecution argued that Stephen's murder was aggravated by evident premeditation, but the court responded that the evidence presented by the prosecution to prove this additional aspect of the murder was insufficient. Another thing, the prosecution was hoping that Evelyn would be found guilty of parricide, which is the killing of a parent or near relative, but the court argued that despite their so-called marriage, Evelyn and Stephen's marriage is legally void because she was only 17 years old when they got hitched. This part of the trial court's decision, as well as the verdict and the sentence, were all affirmed later by the Court of Appeals on the 28th of December 2006 when Evelyn tried to appeal her case to a higher court. The Court of Appeals also added that Evelyn had to pay another 50,000 pesos in moral damages. Evelyn did not want to give up and appealed her case ultimately to the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Her main argument was that the trial court, quote, erred in convicting the accused appellant despite the fact that her guilt for the crime of murder was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt, end of quote. The Supreme Court on the 10th of December 2008, 6 years since Stephen's murder, decided that it affirmed the Court of Appeals decision and therefore also the trial court's decision, maintaining Evelyn's guilty verdict and sentence. Additionally, the Supreme Court also ordered that Evelyn needed to pay another extra 25,000 pesos in exemplary damages. All in all, Evelyn needed to pay Steven's heirs 125,000 pesos. Just for completeness sake, I just want to add here that both Arnold Adoray and Alexander Dagami, the second person who was also at Steven's home when the shooting took place, were found guilty of the same crime as Evelyn and were also sentenced to life in prison. They also appealed their cases, the latest one being in 2011, but just like Evelyn, they were all unsuccessful. After Evelyn's guilty verdict in 2004, we see from the documentary that Margaret had essentially closed the chapter on Evelyn and her crime. She instead decided to focus on raising Jessica and Joshua, who are probably adults by now. There's not been any update or social media presence that I can see from 2006 onwards, merely very few articles reporting about the convictions and appeals until 2011. The case is closed as far as everybody is concerned. This case has always left me feeling very sad. So many lives were destroyed as a result of a crime that was born out of betrayal and greed. While Steven was not perfect, and I did not find myself agreeing with how Margaret handled a few things during this undoubtedly painful journey in her family's life, nothing could justify murder here. We did not see a case of a battered woman who fought in self-defense or a psychologically abused wife who snapped in the heat of the moment. Whilst I lament the lack of enough sources to draw more information and details from, I genuinely feel sad mostly for Jessica and Joshua, who ultimately lost both of their parents. I hope that they were able to heal and find joy in their lives despite the tragedy that they had to experience at such a young age. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all the support as I launch another season of Lagim, season 5. We have come a long way, and I have to say, I feel a bit emotional thinking about how I started this podcast in my small flats bedroom in Sheffield back in the UK with just my Android phone to record my episodes. Part of me feels that the podcast could be bigger if I had been better at scaling it, or if I had not decided to become a digital nomad, or maybe if I pushed through mental health issues these last few months instead of taking a long hiatus. But I also know that everything happens for a reason. I am where I am because I am meant to be here. As for you, dear listeners, my Lagim fam, thank you so much. My gratitude is endless. Thanks for sticking by me. Isang pakiusap lang po. Please share my social media posts about my episodes and the podcast episodes in general, and the podcast itself. Share it far and wide, please. As I've explained in my last episode, I have lost a lot of listeners and followers due to my stance in Palestine and due to my constant posting about Palestine and other social issues. I do not regret this one bit, but I'm hoping to also reach new listeners who are true crime fans and who are open about what I have to say about all these issues that are near and dear to my heart. So at this point, enough of me blabbering and rambling on. Thank you so much for your help. Thank you so much for listening. Anyway, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you did, make sure to also rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify, because it helps with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know anything about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you Lagim fam, daghang salamat, and mabuhay.